isn't going to be a one way to do sustainability. And I think that's been one of my biggest learnings from hosting these podcast episodes as well. That there isn't one way. There's many ways for companies to make good sustainable decisions for their products and their company. Speaking of sustainability, a podcast where we talk to frontrunners, innovators, and business specialists on, well, sustainability and where they think their industries are headed, and more importantly, how they can make them more sustainable. Hi there, this is Hani Larma from EcoChain, and in today's conversation, I'm speaking to one of our very own environmental specialists, Emma. I think the title of this episode says a lot, so what on earth is an LCA? How does it work? What can it be used for? We're going to give you explanations and also a concrete example of how this works, so stay tuned. So, hi, Emma. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited. So, before we get into our discussion about LCA, could you introduce yourself shortly and what you do at EcoChain?
I'm Emma. I'm an environmental specialist at EcoChain. So what I do is I calculate the LCAs, which we're going to talk about later, for our clients, and I also help them do the LCAs themselves because we find that really important that they also get the skills themselves to do so. And what we also do and what I'm also involved in is like video tutorials on how to do LCAs.
So, you're
Me.
basically an expert on all things LCA, summing it
Well,
up.
yeah.
So, I guess to get this conversation started, I think it would be really good to kind of just give an overview. What on earth is an LCA really?
Yeah, so LCA stands for life cycle assessment. And actually, what it is already in the name. So, what it is like you're analyzing the whole life cycle of a certain product or service or something
Mhm.
else. It can be a lot of different things. And you're just going to look at, okay, what are the impacts of this product or service or something else on like the environment? That is what it's in a nutshell, I guess.
Yeah, so basically it's used for helping companies have a look at their product's environmental footprint and see how they can improve that and make different decisions, right? Whether it's in their communication or in their product to change it to be more sustainable, maybe in marketing. So yeah, that's kind of a good short, quick explanation of what an LCA is. But why should companies actually do an LCA? Why should they get started with this?
Very good question. So you already mentioned like a few different goals that companies might have. On top of that, in general, like it's super important if you want to be more sustainable because these days we kind of have to be more sustainable in our everything we do. Then you need to know what your impact actually is and how you can improve it best. Because what you see often is that people start improvement projects, for example, on packaging or things like that. But packaging actually might not be that big of a impact for your product, and you will only discover where the impact lies if you actually do the assessment of the product. So in that sense, it's super important to measure this and to really make sure that you know what the impact of your product is.
Yeah, definitely. I think what you mentioned there, which is a really key aspect, is that a lot of the companies that come to us, they're really keen to know, are they actually correct where they think their biggest environmental impact is, or is it maybe something else, and they should be focusing their reduction efforts or their sustainability design efforts in a different place than they actually thought was their biggest impact. So I think it's really kind of that measuring to know. And sometimes it will be what you think it is, and other times you might have a surprising one. So yeah, that's really also one of the kind of key reasons, indeed, that it is so important to have that data on those sustainability changes as well.
Yeah. And it's also like one thing maybe to add is that some companies might have most of the impact of their products in their own hands. So it might be, for example, their own production processes that are is causing like most of the
Mm.
impacts. But for other companies, they might lie outside of their own factory gate, so to say.
Right.
And that is also important to know. So what can you do about it yourself? And for what do you need to go to your suppliers?
Yeah, and I guess that's also about working together then with those suppliers to see how you can make some collective change, or maybe even find a new supplier who can make maybe more sustainable components of your product.
And in that sense, it's also important that people do LCAs because if more companies do it, you can actually maybe compare the results and see, okay, how do these differ? And actually, what are other people maybe doing better or what are we doing better? And it really allows people to assess also suppliers on this basis.
Right.
And of course, you always have to be careful in interpreting the results and everything, and you always have to take the model into account. But it's really important to be able to compare, like, how are we doing and what can we do to change this?
Right.
And maybe a competitor of yours is doing it better. And yeah, that is also good to know what you can change.
And I think that's also something that has come up in these conversations as I've spoken to some of our clients, but also some sustainability managers from all different types of fields. That more and more in conversations, it's also coming up that it's not only about, getting those good numbers. It's also about learning what maybe isn't going so well right now and how can we do better and how can we learn from the mistakes that we've made. For example, what you mentioned, that maybe someone already started a project to start working on their packaging and they find out actually that's a very minimal part of the impact. They should be focusing elsewhere. Those are not things that should stop you from moving forward. It's just new information that you can take and keep improving your products and make the improvements even more focused and make them in the right places. We already kind of touched upon this a little bit, but what do our clients mainly use LCA for? Like, how can they actually take this information that they get from an LCA and make it to improve their products?
There's a few different clients actually that we have, a few different types. So there's this one type that is part of the construction sector, and they often need like a value from our LCA for example, for tenders. So in the Netherlands, for example, for tenders, you're often asked to supply your environmental footprint and certain values on this. And so that is one thing that we're doing. And in that sense, there's a certain competition going on between these values of different companies. And other things are, for example, marketing claims. So companies want to show that their product is indeed more sustainable than maybe conventional products in this sector, and then they need something to back that up, or they need to actually measure if this is the case. So that is also a type of client that we have. And then we have the type of client that is making products that is, for example, already longer in the market, and these can be a lot of different products. Construction products, but also other kinds of products. And that actually just really want to make their own production process, for example, or their own products more sustainable and really want to see like, okay, where are the hotspots and what can we do to improve the impact of these
Yeah.
products?
That's really interesting, and also to kind of break that down into those different types of motivations and clients, and what you mentioned as well about backing up claims. That's of course been a pretty big topic recently in terms of greenwashing and showing basically why are you sustainable? How are you sustainable? Consumers and other stakeholders are now asking those right questions, and indeed, having that data and being able to really show this is what we calculated, this is how we calculated it, here are our LCA results, our footprint results. That's really getting more and more important. And I think that that's a really important point as well from the sustainability perspective on especially consumer products, because people really want to know these days. It's not enough to just say, oh, it's green or sustainable. People want to know why.
I think this might also be like a growing customer segment that we will have. But indeed, it's super important to actually indeed put some proof behind those claims because greenwashing is honestly in a lot of places. It's happening a lot. And it's important to actually back this up with data and show that we're doing something.
And it
For
doesn't
sure.
bring us closer to our goal of having a more sustainable business. And a kind of good bridge there would be to get into data, which is actually a big question within the industry, but also something that a lot of new clients are asking us a lot about, and especially with you, Emma, being an environmental specialist, I'm sure you get this question a lot. So, yeah, what kind of data is used in LCA, and how does the different types of data change the output of the results that you receive from your LCA? Of course, I know this is a big topic, but just kind of getting into the surface layer of it. How could we explain the data used in LCA?
Yeah, so this is indeed a super big question. And at the start of each project, we always spend like a lot of time explaining to clients, like, okay, what do you need and where can you gather this data? But yeah, in general, what you need is you have to think about your product or service as a kind of some kind part of some kind of system. So there's materials going in or out, waste going out of your production processes. And then you have, for example, different processes that a product is going through. And depending on whether you are measuring the entire life cycle or just the production of your product, for example, yeah, there will be like a lot of different things involved. First step is to map this whole system of your product that it is part of and what it is coming out of really. And then see, okay, what steps is this process a product going through? What processes, what materials are involved, what wastes, and just to paint a picture of this system and then gathering all the data related to it. That is kind of, in a very general way, what data you
Yeah.
need.
And I've heard also our environmental specialist referring to this as a sort of recipe of your product. So the kind of ingredients that go into building that product, whether it's the electricity, as you mentioned, or whether it's the materials or that type of thing, and then building that into that product pie, if you will.
So it is indeed like a recipe. One of the steps of the LCA is in the end, you get like a list, and this is like the inventory or the recipe of the complete LCA. So that has everything and everything that's going in or out with all the quantities in it. So indeed, you can also see it as a recipe, and you just need to know like, okay, what do I need for this system? What is going in, and build your LCA from there. And yeah, this can mean that data can come from very different places. So it can come from your factory, for example. But if you're also modeling use phase, then it might also be coming from your users. And often you don't really know what's happening at the end of life because, yeah, companies usually are not doing the end of life treatment themselves. So then you will have to use like data available on the internet, for example, and make your own scenarios or use end of life scenarios from, yeah, program operators of LCAs. So there can be a lot of different data sources that you have to combine in order to get to your LCA.
And if you're mentioning the people who maybe don't have all of the end of life, so the kind of disposal of the product once it's being used by the end user, could you explain a little bit what you mean by finding those scenarios online, for example?
So often as a company, you don't have control over certain things. Say I sell you a chair, for example, and well, it's delivered to your door and it stays there. I, as a company, don't know how long you will be using this chair. I might have some information, but I don't actually know. And I also don't know what you're going to do with it after. So will you put it, I don't know, with the waste on the street, or will you sell it secondhand? Will it be reused somewhere? Will someone actually be recycling this chair? That's out of my control. So I don't know what happens. So there you have indeed like a few different options. And one of them is, for example, every country might have like a certain LCA standards, or a certain sector might have that. And that might supply some information on, okay, these are standard scenarios. So they did some kind of market research on the scenarios of the end of life. And then they said like, okay, so we think that 20% will be incinerated of this chair, and 70% will be recycled, and maybe 5% will be landfilled and 5% reused or something like
Okay.
this. Yeah, and that's like one way. And the other way, of course, is to do research yourself. So you might have different sources. It might be the internet, it might be books, maybe, I don't know, or like a survey or with people, and then you can maybe, yeah, get some scenarios in that way.
Right. That makes sense. And this kind of brings us to another topic within data, which is often talked about these days, which is what we call an LCA, the use of primary versus secondary data. We actually do have a podcast episode that I did with another colleague of ours, Sasla, about this topic. But just to quickly recap a little bit, that's those differences between using that primary and secondary data in LCA.
If you have suppliers, for example, what you can do is you can ask them, do you have your own LCA done? And if they do, then that's called like primary data. And that's, of course, the best because it is more accurate. So it's like the most accurate data you can have is if it's coming from your own suppliers and they actually know themselves what their impact is. But usually this is not possible for all your suppliers. I don't think I've ever seen a case where they had like primary information from all their suppliers. So what you do then is you can actually use like a database, like EcoInvent, for example. And that's what we then do to approximate the impact of your suppliers. This has all kind of data points made by, for example, different studies on different suppliers or data provided by the industry. And then this is like, yeah, an approximation of the impact of your supplier,
Yeah.
so to say.
Yeah, indeed. And also I think what is really interesting is I've heard before in regards to some of our clients and use cases that have happened at EcoChain that you can start off with having less knowledge on those products. So you might control a part of the product's manufacturing, but indeed you have some suppliers in which you don't have the raw primary data from yet. And you can still perform a LCA with that secondary data. So from those databases, you can of course make those as accurate as possible with using more specific reference points. So they're not all that generalized as you might think. But then you can also kind of work towards seeing, okay, what were the biggest suppliers with the biggest impact, and start from there by collecting for your next LCA more of that primary data and working towards having more of that in the future as well.
Exactly. I think I'm also a big fan of first doing an LCA as kind of like a baseline as well. And then see, okay, what are the main contributors and can we get better data on this? Is there a way that we can improve this? So indeed, if your biggest contributions to your impact are in the materials, then it does make sense to ask actually your suppliers for more detailed data because yeah, it might change the impact, but then you already have the baseline that you modeled and you can improve the model and improve your own operation at the same time by looking at what you can improve and trying to get more specific data.
Yeah. It's a really
Yeah.
interesting topic for sure. There's even more to be said about it, but considering the time of the podcast, I thought what would be really nice is to do a small example. So, as we talked about before this recording, would be nice to take a snowboard. It's not the most conventional product, but a really interesting one, and kind of go through those steps. How could you actually measure a snowboard's environmental impact using LCA, and what could you do with those results?
Well, interesting example. I like snowboards a lot, so I like this
Good
topic.
topic.
Well, first off, you need to start with the scoping the whole analysis. So I need to know, like, okay, what am I going to measure? Am I going to measure the entire life cycle of my snowboard, or just like the cradle to gate part, for example, so until the door of the factory? So these are the first things that we need to decide. Then we need to understand the system of the snowboard. Let's say that we're doing like a full life cycle analysis of the snowboard.
And a full life cycle analysis, for those who might not know, means
Means that we're going to look at the whole life cycle of the snowboard, so from cradle to grave. So like from the start of the raw materials until it's thrown away and waste treated.
right.
Yeah, so let's say that we're going to look at that. Then we first need to understand all parts of the life cycle. So what is actually happening to the snowboard? How is it produced? How will the waste be treated? What is happening in the use phase? What kind of impacts can be related to that? So yeah, in the case of a snowboard, we know that, for example, it's made with a certain press. There's going all kinds of plastic into the board and like some glue type of things like resins. Those are all like the ingredients of the snowboard, so to say. And then once we know what is going in, what is coming out, how it is produced, we can really search for like representative references for these things and yeah, actually build the model and start assessing the environmental impact.
Mhm.
Yeah, it all starts with understanding the system of the snowboard and everything that's happening around it, like how you're using it, how you're producing it, how you're treating the waste, or how it might be treated. And then actually going from there and finding the references that are, yeah, representative.
Yeah, indeed. And in that case, as we mentioned earlier, maybe you produce the wood in your own factory, but the plastic comes from a supplier, and you might not have all the data there yet, even though you have the exact information on your wood pieces, and maybe you do the pressing in your own factory as well. But it's still important to represent those parts that you don't yet have access to, or you don't know the exact amounts. It's still important to represent that in the calculation to gain a decent understanding of what that part represents in the entire impact.
Exactly, because if you don't, you might start working on the wrong things. You might say like, "Oh, the biggest impact is in my own factory," when in reality it isn't, and you might actually not really be solving any problems. Like
Right.
you will actually focus on the wrong thing. So it's really important indeed.
Yeah, it brings that focus for sure. And when you would get the LCA results, I don't know if we already touched upon this earlier, but of course, there is the carbon footprint, which is quite different than the environmental footprint, which includes a carbon footprint, but also 15 different impact categories. So water usage and that type of things, or water scarcity, I believe, actually. When you would get the LCA results for this snowboard, so those environmental impacts on those different 15 different impact categories, what can you say from that? What could this fictional snowboard company do with those results?
So that is actually a very interesting question because indeed people are often or like really often like focusing on the carbon footprint, but there's more than just the carbon footprint. And there are so many other categories that you can look at. So in that sense, what you should actually do, what not all companies or actually most of them maybe are not doing, is actually look at all the categories and see like, okay, wait, in this category, actually the glue, for example, of the snowboards is contributing way more than the other things. And in this category, like the plastics, for example, are the biggest contributor. And in that sense, you have to really look at the full picture because, for example, you might be decreasing a bit of your global warming impact, but this might actually increase your impact in another category. And in that sense, it's sometimes hard to get like a really definitive answer from your LCA of what is better because something might improve in one category but worsen in another.
What should a company do in that case? Because you're right, that's really tricky. If you have 15 different impact categories and the choices, of course, affect each of them if you change a material to another one, what should a company do when they're looking at these types of results?
So that is, of course, like a really hard question because it's a bit subjective of like, what are your priorities? What is the main thing that you would like to improve, for example, and in what areas? A good example, I think, is going for solar panels. So if you install solar panels on your factory, for example, your energy impact will improve. Like, so the impact of the carbon footprint and pretty much any category will improve, but for the abiotic depletion, so the depletion of minerals and metals, yeah, that will increase. And then the question is, okay, so is that enough reason to not take those solar panels? That you have to think about for yourself. Like there's not one right answer, but of course, if you're improving across almost all categories, I would say go for the solar panels. But it's something you have to think of, like what is the best overall choice? And if something improves in almost all categories, then I think, yeah, that's a pretty clear decision to me. I think in the future, there should just be more recycling of solar panels, for example, or it should be made possible to do this. And we should use those resources in a better way. But that is something that we also probably, hopefully, as humanity will do.
It's such an interesting topic because I think this is the question working in sustainability that I get most often, or in sustainable business, I should say, that I get most often. Like, what should I do to be more sustainable? And I think this all goes back to this measurement and having these different priorities that you're setting for your company, being critical, looking at all the opportunities that you have to improve on, and making decisions. And those are also sometimes tough decisions, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
that there isn't going to be a one way to do sustainability. And I think that's been one of my biggest learnings from hosting these podcast episodes as well, that there isn't one way. There's many ways for companies to make good sustainable decisions for their products and their company, and sometimes that's about being critical and making those tough choices for what is most important for the goals of that organization and that product.
Exactly. And yeah, sustainability just isn't perfect. And that's also because currently we're just not in a sustainable system. So there are solutions, but they're not like the perfect solution yet. So it is important to be aware of all the impact categories. But yeah, of course, you need to make a decision at some point. And if something is really an improvement and you believe it to be so.
And also, a colleague of ours, Archam, recently in our webinar also pointed out a pretty interesting one. I think there was somebody in the Q&A who was asking a similar question. And what he also mentioned was that it's also important to look at the use of that product because, for example, if you have a product which is a fast moving consumer good, then maybe looking at the recyclability or the end of life, as we call it, for the product is really important because the turnaround of those products is pretty quick. Whereas something that should be at least hopefully in use for decades, it may be very important, but maybe to a lesser extent than in this case, for example.
Definitely. Yeah, I think indeed for some products that you're throwing away immediately, like for example, single-use plastics or something like that, of course, that is such a big waste that the end of life would be really important. So yeah, I think that is a thing.
And also, I think, lastly, for our fictional snowboard example, so hypothetically, we've used some of our primary data. We're really proud that we're able to have this really accurate data on a big chunk of our snowboard, but we are still using those references from EcoInvent, for example, on some of our components. What would be the most important in the communication of these results as well? Because let's say it's used for marketing to back up our claims about our sustainable snowboard. What would be, from an environmental specialist perspective, the most important there?
That is actually a really good question because you can do an LCA, but you always have to communicate that there is a certain level of uncertainty involved.
I think one of the things that we've seen a lot being spoken about in the media and so is really this transparency that people really, really need from companies. It's great that there are a lot of progress is made, but I think it's also important to be honest about the data that you don't have. So, for example, mentioning, yes, this is exactly where our information came from, mentioning where the references have come from, if you've used any kind of secondary data, also just being transparent about where you're at currently in your sustainability journey. I had such an interesting conversation with Oh My Bag earlier, a brand from Amsterdam who makes bags, that company. And they were also mentioning that they more and more want to talk about things that they are not there yet with and that they still need to work on. And hopefully they can also inspire other people with learning from their mistakes so that others can maybe not make those or can collectively become more sustainable as an industry. So I think that's also a really interesting aspect.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's also what we need. So if you want to truly like do something and improve your impact or improve like the industry in general, you need to be transparent and share these kind of things. Because only if we're doing this, then we can actually like really make a change. Because yeah, you can make great claims, but if you're not open about it, then that doesn't really help a lot, you know? Like you have to, I think, be really open about what you're doing, and that would really be ideal if everybody was doing that.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Emma. This is a really interesting conversation, and I hope we've given our audience a little bit more clarity on what LCA is, how it can be used, and how you can use those results for your company.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Emma.
Thanks for having me.
Bye bye. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for watching this chat. If you enjoyed this episode, please click here to subscribe or here for more recent episodes. Bye bye.